All right, good evening, everyone. Hope everyone's having a good Monday so far, but welcome to our political aspects of intergovernmental relations class session tonight. We have a pretty light agenda tonight. We only have four articles that we are going to be discussing. And so I think this might be one of our shorter sessions tonight. But if you've looked at the spreadsheet, you'll know that once we get to next week and the fiscal aspects of federalism, we have more articles to cover. So next week will be a little bit longer than we probably will be this week. But on our agenda for this week, we do have those four political aspects articles. The first one, the Camisa article, looking at governments as interest groups, that one belongs to Chris. Then the Ann Ohm Bowman article, looking at trends in interstate cooperation. That one no one signed up for, so that's one that I will take care of. Then we have the Durthick article looking at ways of achieving national objectives. That one belongs to Alfonso. And then our fourth and final article tonight, looking at beyond preemption, no one signed up for, so that's an article that I will handle. So only four articles on the agenda tonight. But before we get into those articles, I think it's probably instructive to talk a little bit about why we spend an entire week, devote an entire week to the political aspects of intergovernmental relations, and just kind of set the stage a little bit before we get into a discussion of some of these articles. So I think one of the primary reasons why we have an entire week devoted to the political aspects of intergovernmental relations is when you think back to your 500 course and Woodrow Wilson and the politics administration dichotomy that comes out of Wilson's Study of Administration article from way back in 1887. I think hopefully you remember the whole idea behind this politics administration dichotomy is that Wilson argued that if we can separate politics and administration, then we can borrow all these other innovations from other countries and apply them to our administrative system and make our administrative system more efficient, more effective, essentially to do a more efficient job of doing what he called the quote unquote business of government. We know very early on, as of the 1930s, many, including John Gauss, stood up and said there really isn't this clear distinction between the political world and the administrative world. And instead, we see a lot of interconnection between those two worlds. Politics bleeds over into administration, administration bleeds over into politics. We see administrators involved in politics in a lot of different ways. We see administrators who provide advice and counsel to policymakers as they are formulating new public policies. We see administrators who are engaged in the rulemaking process. A lot of these policies, as we've talked about before, come out of legislative bodies in a very vague and ambiguous manner. A lot of the details are not in that legislation because you put too many details in legislation, it becomes next to impossible to get a majority to agree to that legislation. So you tend to leave it relatively vague and ambiguous. This vague and ambiguous legislation that comes out of Congress and comes out of state legislatures, we then need to try and put some flesh on the bones in terms of how will we actually implement this policy. And so all that flesh on the bones comes from the administrative rulemaking process. And so whenever we have administrators involved in the administrative rulemaking process, by establishing those rules with public comment, because obviously you have to have a public comment period, but by establishing those administrative rules, what we are essentially doing is we are formulating policy and we're formulating the ways in which that policy will be applied in terms of to eligible beneficiaries and all those good things that go into the implementation of a policy. So those are a couple ways in which administrators are involved in the political side. We also know that policymakers are also involving themselves in the administrative side as well. Policymakers oftentimes do this through the use of casework. And we know that members of Congress get involved in a lot of casework representing their constituents whenever their constituents have grievances or problems navigating the administrative side of the equation, navigating the bureaucracy. And so whenever we have a member of Congress who engages in this casework, they are interjecting themselves into the administrative side of the equation. And so you have the political side bleeding over into the administrative side. Now, I spent many years here as department chair, and I've run into a few situations where we would have students who were in the program maybe 20 or 25 years ago, and for whatever reason, life intervened and they weren't able to finish their degree. Now they want to come back and finish their degree, but they have courses that are 20 and 25 years old. So they want to revalidate those courses instead of retaking them. And then we have to give them the unfortunate news that we cannot revalidate courses that are more than 10 years old. And the logic behind that is that the world of public administration changes. And so some of those theories that we may have covered 20 or 25 years ago are not quite as germane to modern public administration. And 20 or 25 years ago, we were talking primarily about singular agencies implementing singular policies and programs. Now we have agencies working in public-private, public-nonprofit partnerships. There's a lot more governing networks that really explain how policies get implemented in public administration. Some of the budget format approaches that were used in the late 90s are no longer quite as commonly used today. And we have new and more innovative approaches that we use today. And so a lot of that information is outdated. So I would give them the unfortunate news that no, this 25-year-old class needs to be retaken. And then they would go to their member of city council or their member of the state legislature, or sometimes even their member of the House of Representatives. And then that member would then contact me in terms of doing the casework, or their staff members would contact me, say, is there anything we can do for this student? That's that type of casework that goes on where you have policymakers going from the political side into the administrative side. So because of that bleeding over of the political and administrative world, it's necessary for us to focus very squarely on the political aspects of intergovernmental relations and how we administer these programs across the three levels of government, realizing that we are doing it within this highly charged political type of environment. So that's one reason why we have a week on political aspects. A second reason has to do with this ultimate arbiter of intergovernmental relations questions, and that is the Supreme Court. When the Supreme Court renders decisions on federalism types of cases, they are establishing precedent. And oftentimes when they establish that precedent will either refer to this issue as a constitutional federalism issue, or it will refer to the issue as more of a political issue. And we may mention this last week when I gave you the example of National League of Cities versus Usury, a case from 1976, compared to that Garcia versus Sampta case in 1985. In the National League of Cities versus Usury case, the Supreme Court said, what you pay your employees as a local government, that is up to you. We are going to provide you with constitutional protection from federal government interference. However, 9 years later, because you had a different majority on the Supreme Court came to the completely opposite opinion and said, no, we were wrong in 1976. This is not a judicial type of thing for us to decide. This is a political issue. And so therefore, you have to go out there and seek a political redress for your grievances with Congress. That's just a very small microcosm in that 9 year period of time between 1976 and 1985 to kind of show you this dichotomy between when it's considered to be something that is constitutional and therefore judicially decided versus when it's an issue that is subject more to political redress and to the political world. And we've seen that throughout the entire development of federalism. And I don't want to inundate you in this class with a whole bunch of Supreme Court cases. Previous manifestations of this course had a lot of Supreme Court cases in it, but I don't really want to run the risk of this becoming kind of like a legal class. But just to highlight some of those important cases where the court either said this issue is constitutional or this issue is political. We've already mentioned McCulloch versus Maryland. And we know in McCulloch versus Maryland back in 1819, that's where the Supreme Court told us about reciprocal tax immunity, that one level of government could not tax another level of government. And that's because of this idea of state governments are sovereign entities in that they have their own locus of power. And if we allow the state government to tax the federal government or the federal government to tax the state government, that is equivalent to allowing one level of government to destroy the other level of government. So as a result of McCulloch versus Maryland, whenever you had state governments that cried foul when the federal government tried to tax their holdings, then you had the Supreme Court coming in saying, we will protect you from that type of quote unquote transgression on the part of Congress, that Congress is overstepping its constitutional boundaries. We'd already also mentioned a case last week, the Wickard versus Filburn case from back in the 1840s. In that case, the Supreme Court essentially sided with the national government and said, even though the sale of this wheat is not going across state boundaries, even though it doesn't directly affect interstate commerce, we are still going to allow this federal law to stand, this federal law that limits the ability of people, farmers within a state, to grow over a certain amount of wheat. And so that was very much a pronouncement of national government power, much to the detriment of state governments. Last week, I think someone in their discussion mentioned the Collector v. Day case in 1871. Collector v. Day is another important case in that it not only established this idea judicially of dual federalism, where we had these two different spheres of influence, the national sphere and the state sphere, but then we also had in Collector versus Day, the Supreme Court saying essentially that the federal government could not impose a federal income tax upon state governments. And so it precluded that federal income tax because of the sovereignty of the state governments. Now, Collector v. Day was superseded in 1939 by a follow-up case, Grays versus New York, where the Supreme Court kind of undid that. And where the Supreme Court basically said, instead of following this precedent in Collector versus Day, we are going to consider taxation to be more of a political issue as opposed to state governments having constitutional protection under reciprocal tax immunity. More examples, and we're not going to go through them all, but in the 1960s, we're all familiar with the Warren Court in the 1960s and how the Warren Court throughout the 1960s continued to expand the civil liberties that people were provided for in the Bill of Rights, and did so by extending these limitations on government action to include limitations on state government action as well. So you had cases, a whole litany of cases like Gideon versus Wainwright. And Gideon versus Wainwright extended the protection of right to counsel to include actions against state governments. And so in that instance, you saw the Supreme Court coming forth and saying, well, these protections not only are protections against national government action, they're also protections against state government action. So this is a constitutional issue, and we're going to provide people with these constitutional protections against the actions of state governments. Miranda versus Arizona, the reason why you have your Miranda rights that are read to you, that comes out of the 1960s court as well. The Benton versus Maryland, a case that extended double jeopardy protections and said that state governments could no longer try someone for the same crime twice, essentially saying this is a constitutional issue, and so therefore states are precluded from doing it. It's not something that's going to be argued out in the political world. You can fast forward in the 1990s, and throughout the 1990s, we saw another whole sequence of cases that dealt with this issue of, is federalism constitutional or is it more political in nature? One great example of that was the case of New York versus the US in 1992. Back in the 1980s, Congress had passed this piece of legislation known as the Low-Level Radioactive Waste Policy Act. Say that 10 times fast. The Low-Level Radioactive Waste Policy Act. And in this Low-Level Radioactive Waste Policy Act, what Congress said is it said two things. One, you have to establish these compacts in all the different regions of the country. But number two, states had to take title of the low-level radioactive waste that was being produced within their states. So any low-level radioactive waste that is being produced within your state, ultimately, if no one else claimed ownership of it, it was up to the state to take ownership and take title and take responsibility for that waste. Well, that piece of legislation then went before the court in 1992, in this case, New York versus US. And in a decision written by Sandra Day O'Connor, she said that the 10th Amendment is just as important as all of the other amendments in the Bill of Rights. In her decision, O'Connor basically lamented the fact that we always tend to elevate First Amendment and Second Amendment and Fourth and Fifth and Sixth Amendment rights above and beyond the 10th Amendment. And in her decision, she said the 10th Amendment is just as important as any other amendment in the Bill of Rights, and it is unconstitutional for state governments to have to be forced to take title of this low-level radioactive waste. So it provided protection to state governments based upon their standing in the U.S. Constitution. So that then became a constitutional issue, something that states didn't have to worry about going and lobbying for and fighting for out there in the political world. Another really important federalism case in the 1990s was the case known as Prince versus United States. And in the Prince versus United States court case, what had happened is that the states had challenged this provision in the Brady Bill. And you're familiar with the Brady Bill. And Brady was the press secretary, deputy press secretary, who was shot in the assassination attempt on President Reagan. And so he and his wife then became big advocates of gun control legislation. And so as part of this gun control legislation, the Brady Bill, it imposed requirements on local law enforcement agencies to conduct background checks and essentially pay for those background checks themselves. So that case then went to the Supreme Court in this case called Prince versus United States. The Supreme Court said that that was the Congress overstepping its constitutional boundaries, that Congress has the ability to require states to do things, to issue what are called writs of mandamus, to order them to do things as long as they are doing it within their Commerce Clause power, within their enumerated power to regulate commerce between the states. This, according to the court, did not have a close enough connection to the Commerce Clause to be constitutional. And so it resulted in something known as the Prince Entitlement. And the Prince Entitlement basically said that the federal government couldn't tell states to take certain types of actions if that order was not in direct alignment with the Commerce Clause of the Constitution. So again, we see the Supreme Court taking a very constitutional judicial approach to that issue of requiring background checks being conducted by local law enforcement agencies. We also saw cases like Griswold versus Connecticut and Roe versus Wade, in which the Supreme Court essentially created this implied right to privacy and said when you read the Constitution, you read the Bill of Rights, the combination of the Third and the Fourth and the Fifth and the Sixth Amendment, those amendments combine together to provide this umbrella of privacy, which is an implied right to privacy. Access to contraception in Griswold versus Connecticut was placed within this umbrella of privacy. In Roe versus Wade, the right to abortion was then also placed within this implied right of privacy, this umbrella of privacy. More recently, we saw the Dodd case, and the Dodd case has now allowed states to pursue their own approaches when it comes to abortion rights laws. We've seen some states who have done it through their state legislatures. We've seen other states that have initiative processes whereby there have been initiatives placed upon the ballot where the voters can vote directly on the issue of abortion rights. But essentially what the court has done is they've taken it out of the constitutional protection category, like it was with Griswold and Roe, and they've placed it more in the political category, whereby politically state legislatures or politically voters, depending on how the state operates, can then make those types of decisions. So it made it more of a political type of a decision. And those are just some illustrative examples of how the Supreme Court can take an issue that perhaps used to be considered constitutional and then transform that issue into a political issue. The more issues the Supreme Court sees as being political issues, the more important it becomes that we understand the political aspects of intergovernmental relations and how governments interact with each other, not just according to their constitutional rights, but also how they interact with each other on a political basis. And again, there are a lot of other examples we can go through, but I think it just gives you a good justification for why this discussion tonight of the political aspects of intergovernmental relations, why this discussion is so important. But without further ado, let's get into our articles for tonight. And our first article is the Camissa article. And like I said, that one belongs to Chris. So Chris, let me give you your moderator, or not moderator, your co-host, right?
Sure.
Okay, you should now be a co-host, so you should be able to share your screen, and I'll turn the floor over to you.
Oh, awesome. Okay, thank you. I'm just gonna pull up my presentation. And can you confirm that you can see my full screen?
Yes, yes, we can.
Oh, perfect. Right. All right. Good evening, everyone, and good evening, Professor. Today I have the article of, I hope I'm saying it right too now, by Marie Camisa, and it is Governments as Interest Groups. So, what are interest groups? I wondered the same question when I dove into this article. And interest groups are these groups that represent government officials, typically government entities, and sort of serve them as their present priority. They have not typically a specific policy that they're after, it's groupings of policies, and they are interested in prioritizing funds for their groups. Think of like if you have a League of Cities, those kind of groups there. I think many of you guys work in the public. I think many of you guys work specifically in cities. So I'm sure that some of you guys have had some type of crossover with them. So again, they're meant to really boost and support the governing body or entities that they support. And there's two types of interest groups that the article outlined, which was the general government groups and then the public official organization. So general government groups focus more on, like I mentioned, like general. So you have five that the article outlined, which is National League of Cities, the U.S. National Governors Association, the National Conference of State Legislature, National Government Association, and then the National Association of Counties. So if you can see like a pattern with this, they're very general and broad. And like I mentioned, they either support a city or a governing body. I'll give some examples of what the governing association has done. But before I do, I wanted to share the other side of it is the public official organizations. And those, as you can see, I have listed American Welfare Association, and then the National Association of Housing. So those obviously have a little bit more of a direct cause and a direct impact on the type of work that they do. So the evolution of interest groups. These types of interest groups started in the 1930s and the 1960s. And back then, it was very easy for these types of groups to get funding from the federal government. And through the evolution of time, down to the 1980, 1990 era, this is when more control was given to the states. Therefore, lack of funding increased, and that also increased lobbying. So now these groups are starting to go after and almost compete against one another for the resources that are available to them, which creates more like a bottleneck, which has spiraled into what is currently right now a need to decentralize the federal government requirements for funds. Right now, there are a lot more stringent requirements that weren't necessarily there back in the day. And I think that's also tied to the politics, also tied to like I from my perspective at least, it's like the federal government was really overarching in the 1900s and then had kind of has loosened up their grip and given states more power. And with given circumstances, of course, I mean, there's more uh, hot topic political items in current day that it's still, um, give and take with the state and the federal government control. So if decentralized, it provides fewer funds. I'm sorry, if decentralized, it provides better opportunity for these types of governing bodies to acquire funding for whatever needs that they may. So, an example of like what those needs could be. So, as I mentioned, the National Governors Association earlier in my presentation. One thing that was interesting in these two examples is that in the COVID-19 pandemic, the federal government made funding available for the states to use, and that could have been for different things. Could have been for like the boosters, right? Also could have been for support services, staffing, that kind of thing with the vaccination centers, and also the ability to provide paid leave and the checks that were being cut. So in this is one key example of how the federal government supported the states by giving them funding and also provided less requirement as well. And this is something that the National Government Association was able to take advantage of. Another example is a disaster relief. So typically, whenever there is a national disaster like a hurricane, especially like the one that happened in Florida, and even some of the other hurricanes that have happened, like in the head of Texas, the federal government makes funding available to the states to help them with emergency services and needs, and also provides them with through the National Governors Association that's lobbying this type of aid, allows the state to be able to use some of this funding with less strings attached than normal. So it's, as you can imagine, it's really helpful for, like, let's say the governor, like Governor Newsom, to have this type of association that really serves as a way to boost his ability to use federal funds. Now, one thing to note that the book was really heavy on was that these associations, these general government groups, do not necessarily, although their services impact and support people and the population, their intent is to support the government entity themselves. So that's kind of like an interesting dynamic I thought that the article touched on, is that typically cities will like serve a customer or like a resident, but here the actual focus person, the stakeholder, is the governing entity or body. So, with that being said, I wanted to provide some questions on and taking it back. I think this is kind of helpful to relate it back, this type of work to relate it back to the our own communities. So my first question for the group, and I'll probably take a look at to see who raises their hand and all that. But my first question is, what areas of your community slash city could better be improved with federal funding? And that could range through things that you may see on your commute, or maybe things that you have noticed around recreation, whatever it may be. Is there anyone that has anything to share on what could be improved in your community or city from federal funding? And I see Amanda, your hand is up. Go ahead, Amanda.
So I work for a community services department, and I feel like lately the past couple of years, had a lot of really big capital projects trying to make improvements on our parks. And a lot of those projects, depending on what is involved, are in like the millions of dollars when you incorporate labor and infrastructure. And our whole department's budget is like 14 or 15 million per year. So when you consider like how expensive those projects are, a lot of times we have to turn to finding like federal grants and funding to even get them done because we don't have that much built into our budget for that. So I think that would be like we have some grants that we'll get, but a lot of times there's really strict requirements on like the income level in the area where the park is and things like that. And just being slightly above that income requirement can dictate if you get funds or not. So it can be really hard to make improvements. Like I have a park I oversee that was probably built in the 60s and it is a disaster zone. And we just don't have the money to make those improvements right now until we find kind of like a source like that. So for me, that would
That's
be that example.
that's great. That's a great one too. I think, and I totally agree with that. I think the some of these government groups that I've mentioned, I think the whole purpose of it is to make it where they're trying to lessen those requirements to make it easier for like cities like the ones that you work for, to be able to access that and then do those changes for the parks, do those changes that are necessary that aren't necessarily um, accrued in the annual budget that you guys work on. So that's a great response. I totally agree with that. Does anyone else have anything that they'd like to share for what areas could be improved with federal funding in your community? No. I think Amanda hit that. So we can go ahead and move on to the next question. So, do you think it's fair for different states to get different levels of federal funding? Why or why not? And this kind of ties into the whole notion of these government groups. That's why they want to lobby so hard, because obviously there's disproportion in how much funding a state may get versus another. So again, do you think it's fair for different states to get different levels of federal funding? Why or why not?
I mean, I think it's generally a good thing for different states to get different levels of funding, just kind of like based upon need, right? Like in an ongoing sense, different states have different needs, and we want all states to function at like probably like a certain baseline, and so certain states are just going to need more money, but then also there's situations like what's ongoing with the hurricanes, and so some states just need more money because they're in emergency situations. And so I think that we have to remain open to giving funding to different states based upon their needs.
Absolutely. Like tying it to a natural disaster. Yeah. Um, I agree with that. I think like obviously some states have different needs, right? I mean, we could take a state like Idaho, maybe having issues with tornadoes, but nothing to the severity of something that like Florida gets in terms of hurricane, right? There's a trade-off right there. And also, if the likelihood of population also plays into a factor of that too, right? Like if California has more people per, I forget what the measurement's called, but like more people per mile or per square foot, whatever, then obviously like more funding has to be allocated to the bigger population there. So it kind of creates a disparity. And that's why I feel like there has to be some lobbying efforts done by these groups here. I'm sorry, I see two hands up. I'll go ahead with Esmeralda, 'cause I think I saw your hand first. Go ahead.
Yeah, I agree. I feel that for sure, like each state has different needs. Each state has, different people that it represents. I do have to kind of like tie it back to what the professor was saying. Even though they have like, I guess their criteria to apply for certain funding, it does kind of seem to the type of political party that that state has, they might ask for or apply for certain more funding in specific areas of government. So I feel like that also affects it. But what Daniel said as well, like some states don't suffer from hurricanes. We have like the wildfires, and I know that's been an ongoing issue to increase federal funding, but um, for some reason, the federal government, and I quote, mentions that firefighters are unskilled laborers. So that's been a very hard issue. And it breaks my heart because I know they make less than minimum wage. And I feel that for sure, like either we had to have more stakeholders or just different groups advocating. Um, but yes, I feel that different states should receive different levels of federal funding.
I like how you brought it too, right? Like Daniel brought up the disaster aspect of it, but you're bringing up the different political agendas almost that one state has over another. I hadn't considered that aspect actually. Whereas, maybe one state that's leaning a little bit more on the Democrat side may value, I don't know, like school safety or may value a little bit more on the education side, whereas another state maybe a little bit on the more conservative side could value other values too. So I definitely agree, and I also agree with the firefighting aspect of it too, where it's like one service may be more valued in one state versus another, therefore more money is getting put into that. I think we saw just I don't and I was my last comment on that. I think we saw in like the public budgeting class where I remember seeing that a lot of the I think that was like a growing theme in the on the budget analysis that we were all doing for one of our projects that like the police force is one of the one of the departments that gets like the most funding, at least in Southern California, right? So I think that could be different in maybe another state, depending on how what's on the higher hierarchy of needs. So totally agree with that. Esmeralda, thank you for your response. We're gonna go ahead and go with Maria.
Yeah, I was gonna say that like in areas like in West Hollywood, they often contribute significantly to like federal revenue through taxes, and supporters argue that they should receive proportional funding to address like local needs, especially in high cost living areas where public services may require more investment. And that's why it's like federal funding often reflects specific needs and priorities such as poverty levels, natural disasters, or population density. Some argue that this targeted approach ensures resources go where they are most needed, regardless of states' overall contribution to federal revenue.
Absolutely. Yeah. So like that kind of equates to like you're saying, the higher tax you're paying, the more direct benefit you'll get for the area that you're living in. I think that's really true. That's unfortunate with like disadvantaged communities too, right? It's like you obviously those communities are more reliant on this federal funding because the local entities or the local people don't have too much to contribute and give back. So kind of like tying back to what Amanda was saying, it's like it's really makes cities and local governments really dependent on this federal funding based off the type of people that they serve too. So I agree with that too. Thank you all for your responses. Esmeralda, did you have another thing to add, or is your hand just up? Just up.
No, I'm done. I'm so bad at this. Usually I answer questions and I I can't.
I'm literally the king of like keeping my hand up, and I get called out on that so many times.
I'm so
Okay.
sorry.
No, you're good. You're good. Thank you. Okay, so next question here is, should states or the federal government have more say in how the schools are funded? So should states or the federal government have more say in how schools are funded? Anyone want to take a crack at that one? And I can actually start on it too. So oh, Jeremy, go ahead.
So funny enough, I think it relates back to the topic that we had in our discussion where I feel like it should be in like a both, like an and, it should be both of them. I think the federal government should have a base level of what it should be, but also states should have a bigger say in the sense of they know what their students aren't achieving at or what they're overachieving at or what they need more specifically. But I definitely do think it should be both.
Mm. Yeah,
But let's say to answer your question, let's go with the federal government.
right, because almost it's like some fundamental things that should be like, for example, like U.S. history, right? Like U.S. history should be something like at least I equate it. I always equate like federal decision, federal rulemaking to stuff that creates the best outcome for the entire country. And just my opinion, I feel like something that should be funded is like U.S. history, so that everyone kind of learns about like where the country was formed from, and to avoid issues in the future. So that I think that's something that like should be put on by the federal government for the schools to be able to really emphasize some of that. But thank you. And we'll go ahead with Esmeralda.
Thank you. I would argue that the federal government should have a say in how schools are funded. Because if they are funding it, they can like establish more like standards or just kind of like pinpoint like, hey, like these are the things that we want to teach like throughout um different states, like how you mentioned like US history and like have some like standards because other states it's been like they take things out and they don't tell the students the whole story. And that's coming from the state. So that's dangerous because they're not learning, they're instead of expanding and giving them all this information, they're kind of like nitpicking what to teach. And if the federal government is funding it, then, they could establish some guidelines and like things to cover. And like you mentioned, like US history is super important and everyone should have like a basic understanding. So that's just my point of view.
Absolutely. A great point. Um, Go ahead, Emily.
Yeah, I know, like, I think the pretty common opinion might be, or just based on how the US system is set out, that states should probably have more of a say just because it's typically more of a local issue, a local responsibility. But I do agree with what Jeremy and Esmeralda were saying too. And also with like the introduction of charter schools, for example, in California, which theoretically, could have a positive impact, creates innovation in the classroom and provides more choices for parents and whatnot. But what we're also seeing, or critics are also seeing of it, is that it's kind of creating or draining resources from other public schools to putting it into these charter schools, and it's creating kind of a division almost. And so I think I agree with them that the federal government could kind of maybe step in when that imbalance is happening.
Absolutely. It's like a give and take, right? Like there's like core values that we want everyone to learn, but also we can't also put that on the states because like you're saying, picking and choosing. And I think there's a lot of danger to that. If a school has complete funding over something, they can tell their own story. They can have their students learn certain aspects that may not be universally sound, at least in the country. But good
Right.
point, Ms.
And
Flynn.
I'm not demonizing charter schools either. I don't know if there's any charter school teachers here, but it was just, there's pros
Yeah,
and cons to everything. So
yeah. No, I totally agree too. Alfonso?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that I agree. I think there should be a balance, but I think it also depends on the policy, right? It's always policy by policy. And I think we have
Yeah.
an example of the federal government kind of having influence on state education through the No Child Left Behind, and it really focusing on numbers and tests and standardization. And I don't think a lot of people thought that there was a lot of positives that came out of it. So yeah.
Yeah. No, solid point. That's actually one of the items that was in the article was talking about the No Child Left Behind and kind of like the desire for these types of interest groups to move away from strict requirements and kind of going against that because of, like you mentioned, it maybe wasn't the best policy or wasn't the best approach. And so yeah, it's kind of like I really appreciate that point, Alfonso. It's a give and take is what it's essentially like there's stuff that the government should fund, but also the federal government doesn't also get it right every single time. And so therefore there should be a balance between the states and the federal government, which is kind of what these interest groups are trying to push for, at least more liberty for themselves. And before we move on to the next question, I just want to check in, Professor, am I still good on time or am I going over?
No, you're perfect.
Okay, awesome. So my last question is, and Amanda kind of hit this at the very beginning, but I'm very curious. I'd like for anyone to share their experience with pursuing state or federal grant funding. Was it challenging, fair, or easy? Um, Anyone that has pursued any type of grant or federal funding, or even professionally or academically. Anyone want to chime in about kind of their experience on that, and how they felt? All right, Heidi, whenever you're ready.
Yeah, I think I don't have any direct experience, but currently within my agency, we have a specific program called self-determination. And in that program, our agency sought monies to develop specialists within our agency to support this new program that had new rules. They had a new structure, resources development that we had to, develop, for lack of a better word. And so one of the challenges, it wasn't initial, it's more like it is right now, where the monies came in and a bunch of positions were open. Certain departments were developed with the monies that we received. But now, with the funding challenges at the state and federal level, all of those monies are going away. So the challenge is now to continue the work that needs to be done with less money. So sometimes it's a godsend in the sense that the money comes in and is supportive of programs that are new, but at the same time, when the money's run out and the state or the agency needs to figure out how to continue the work and do it well with limited funds. So that can be challenging.
That's an interesting dynamic. And it's almost like you have to it's almost like you have to it's unfortunate, right? Like if say that type of program or that type of benefit was really it was really good for the city or the place it represents. It's kind of unfortunate because then you have to cut your losses and be like, I can't continue doing that because we just don't have the funding to support something like that. Or you start kind of building it into your annual budget where you're like, all right, we have to, where maybe management's like, we have to go for that grant to continue this program, which puts extra pressure on the staff that has to apply for the staff that has to carry out that grant work. So no, that I hadn't considered that, Heidi. I like that, like the point that you brought up.
I have something to add. I couldn't figure out how to raise my hand.
Sure.
Um, so I do have experience. So I used to work for the grants department at LA County Parks and Rec. So there we would apply for local, state, and federal grants. And I would say for sure that federal grants have always been the most challenging to apply to, mainly because they're typically the most competitive because you are competing with multiple states and different agencies with that as well, because you could be a county office or you can be like depending on the grant, but you could also be like a nonprofit or a philanthropy organization also going for certain funds. So it is way more competitive and also has a lot more requirements in regards to documentation and just prepare documentation like site plans and budgets and in-kind budgeting
I
as well. So yeah, and then state funding, there's you have less of a pool, but it's still very, very competitive depending on how much was allotted per either whether it's region like Northern California versus Southern California and so forth. So if I had to choose which one is the most challenging based on my experience, it would definitely be federal grants.
Perfectly said. Thank you for sharing that. And also really cool that you have the grants experience as well too. You really understand the challenges of this first and foremost. Thank you for sharing that. All right, I see Alexa, your hand is up.
Yeah, I also have a little bit of experience applying and administering grants. I think I can echo everyone's sentiments that federal grant funding is by far the most challenging to apply to. I think that they try to build fairness into it. I don't know that they try to build any ease into it. But I do know that, their NOFOs tend to be extremely extensive and have a lot of different rules and nuances in terms of, whether they're giving a certain amount to certain states, to rural versus urban, to specific like sustainability or environmental type of types of initiatives. And I found that, state funding tends to be a lot more uniform. The state has already is more like just in a hurry, in my opinion, to spend the money before the feds revoke it. And so they tend to be like, oh, we got, a $300 million allotment and we'll do a pass-through funding to you and we'll, act as your handler to this federal funding, but you have to follow our initiative and our rules and meet these key indicators in order to maintain the funding. But yeah, I think that federal funding is by far the most effective. But with that comes a lot of hoops to jump through and a whole lot of reporting and requirements to be met. And that's if you can even secure the funding in the first place, depending on whether, your initiative is, sorry to say, like sexy enough for in terms of government speak. But that's been my experience.
Yeah, absolutely. No, and I'm happy that you brought those points up. Yeah, it's definitely different needs for different states. I'll chime in with my experience working in water conservation. One thing that I have experience for applying for these grants, I apply for both state and federal government grants. Federal government is definitely the most challenging for exactly what you're saying. I do think that the federal government has like certain ways that they kind of weigh these grant applications, right? I mean, they have to award certain parts to the rural. Yeah, so I have an interesting thing I always see on my applications that I have to apply for is like there is a consideration, although I really support it and I stand by it, it's really good that they're doing it. They give like extra points for if your program or your project benefits a tribal community. Unfortunately for me, I mean, I don't really have too many tribal communities in my service area, but it gives ability for others to get more points if they do have that in there. So it kind of creates like this almost like this equity and fairness, but it also creates more challenges. Like you're saying, reporting is a nightmare. So no, I really appreciate what you shared and totally agree. And I think that's kind of like to tie it back into the PowerPoint here. I think that's kind of like what these government interest groups are trying to do is make the funding easier for all of us to be able to access that without having all these hoops that we have to jump through and all these extra barriers for accessing and even completing those grants. But again, grants is like one portion of like the stuff that they focus on. But anyways, I just wanted to tie it back there. And seeing as there's no more responses, I think I'm going to end the presentation here and just thank you all for your responses. Really appreciate the back and forth and for tuning into my presentation. Thank you.
Perfect, Chris. Thank you very much. And thank you to everyone who contributed. That was a great discussion of the article. And so I really appreciate that. And wonderful job, Chris. Just a couple points that I'll add. I think that all the examples everyone provided well, those are all very good and they really relate very well to the article. We have these types of public interest groups that are interest groups such as National League of Cities, the National Governors Association, National Conference of State Legislatures. They do kind of feel a little different and operate a little different than our more traditional interest groups. Traditional interest groups, usually what happens is you have an entrepreneur who is very interested in a specific issue, and will then put forth the resources in order to incentivize people to join that group. Then that more traditional interest group will have a relatively narrow policy focus. We'll be looking at one narrow policy issue, and their scope will be a lot narrower than these governmental interest groups. So governmental interest groups, because they're made up of mayors or they're made up of governors, they usually have a more spatial type of focus in that their scope is a lot bigger. It's more jurisdictional. And instead of looking more at the outcome of a policy, they look more at the implementation. So a lot of things they lobby for will be oriented around implementing this policy differently than the way in which it's been implemented before, or making some tweaks to the implementation of this policy. And so they kind of function a little bit differently than what you would consider to be a traditional interest group. And over the years, these governmental interest groups have really taken on different roles depending upon which group you're looking at. So, give you an example, the National League of Cities. National League of Cities has really taken on a role of advocacy through information. And so they've become very well known for doing studies and putting together reports to then provide to Congress to then advocate for a change to policy or a change in which that policy is being implemented. One of the big successes of the National League of Cities was the adoption of the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act back in the 1990s. And when I was in grad school, a grad school colleague of mine got a job with the National League of Cities, and her job was to organize National Unfunded Mandates Day. And so one day per year, she would organize all these events all across the country in these different cities to raise awareness about the detrimental impacts of unfunded and partially funded mandates on cities. And it became successful enough so that they were able to advocate in Congress for the passage of the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act. The National League of Cities is very well known for its annual fiscal survey of the cities. My dissertation chair for about 15 years was in charge of that study. And what they would do is they would literally do a survey of every major city across the entire country to get a sense of where they stood in terms of their fiscal health. And then my dissertation chair would go to the National Press Club in DC once per year and would then present the report. And so I think that's kind of the role National League of Cities took on in terms of putting all this information together, becoming kind of the experts to then advocate for changes in policy. You can contrast that to a group such as the National Governors Association, the NGA. I think in the article, Commissioner refers to them as a collection of 50 prima donnas, which they really kind of are, because they are these governors and they're much more removed from the everyday implementation of these policies as compared to their mayor counterparts. And so the National Governors Association kind of takes a more 30,000 foot level to a lot of these issues. They went and they built a beautiful building in Washington, D.C. on K Street alongside all these lobbying firms and really took kind of that glitz and glamour approach to advocacy, whereas National League of Cities took a much more nuts and bolts type of approach to gathering information and using that information for the purpose of advocacy. One of the interesting things we saw with a lot of these public interest groups is that in the 1960s, when you had this centralization of decision making in Washington, D.C., you had all of these interest groups that rushed to Washington and started building these beautiful headquarters in Washington, centralizing all their resources in Washington, D.C., because that's where the decisions were being made. Then along comes new federalism with Nixon and the new federalism of Reagan in the 1980s, and a lot of these decisions start to get decentralized back down to the state level. And so you kind of had them like a duck out of water in that they had all the resources in DC, but that's not where a lot of these decisions are being made in the 1980s. So much so that we saw one organization, the National Conference of State Legislatures, actually pull their operations out of DC and then relocate in, I believe they're in Lexington, Kentucky, and actually move back to a state level in close to, not in a state capital, but close to a state capital, aligned with the university where they could actually be at the state level where those decisions were actually beginning to be made. And so where the decisions are made, the locus of that decision making really has a major impact upon how these public interest groups allocate the resources and how they behave. But I think there is a fundamental difference between the way in which they operate and the goals and the scope of these public interest groups as compared to a more traditional interest group like the AARP or the NRA or one of those other groups that we usually think of when we think about interest groups. And I think the utility of the Camisa article is, or Camisa, is how the author really challenged us to think about governments as interest groups and how they have this role to play in the political world. And it's not just all about administration, it's about playing the political world, playing these political games, lobbying Congress, lobbying state legislatures, and they really have become much more of these political animals through the conduit of joining together into these public interest groups. So it just kind of underscores everything we started out talking about tonight in terms of the more political aspect of intergovernmental relations, and that's why we have such a pronounced role played by these public interest groups. Then the Ohm-Bowman article, then kind of picks up on this theme and talks about some of the practical mechanisms that state governments use in order to cooperate with each other, oftentimes to push back on federal government influence. And in the Ohm-Bowman article, Anne points out 3 different ways in which states tend to cooperate with each other. Now, we know from our discussion last week and the discussion of the paradox of the middle tier that state governments, even though they predated the national government, even though state governments came first, they still have trouble working together because of all these turf wars between the states. You know, they compete with each other for corporate property tax base. They compete with each other for citizens. And so you've got all this competition that sometimes precludes their willingness to work together. But Bowman describes for us 3 different ways in which they do tend to work together. The first way she describes to us is through this idea of interstate compacts, whereby they'll join together into these compacts, into these alliances, in order to try and advocate and make changes to policy design and policy implementation. She gives you a chart in the article in figure 10-1, I believe it is, where she shows the different levels of activity in interstate compacts by state. Those that are very highly involved in interstate compacts, those that are high average, average low, and then low. Since we all live in California, we all wonder, well, where's California? California is in the average category, so around 25 or so compacts on average here in California. In the low category, you have states like Hawaii and Wisconsin. Now, Hawaii is not a huge surprise to us, I think, just because of their geographic location, that it may be a little bit more difficult traditionally for them to join into these compacts, but some states are very high users of compacts, some are very low users of compacts. These compacts also don't really prescribe the actual number of members in a compact. So some of the compacts are very large. They consist of the vast majority of states, but there are a lot of compacts out there that are bilateral in that they're compacts consisting of only 2 members. Technically, under the US Constitution, in order for a state to join with other states in a compact to be sanctioned, that compact must be approved by Congress. However, a lot of these compacts have not been approved by Congress. They're much more informal in nature. And so by joining together into this compact, they all have a shared interest and they're going to advocate together for that shared interest. The likelihood of a state to continue to join interstate compacts in the future will be directly contingent upon how much success they've had in the past as a member of an interstate compact. And just commonsensically, if you've had success with being a compact member in the past, you're probably going to continue joining compacts in the future. If you haven't had success, you're probably going to find another avenue such as multi-state legal action or uniform state legislation. But if you've had success, you'll probably continue to join these compacts. The success of a compact is really dependent upon several different factors. And let me give you a good example of that. So I had mentioned earlier on this piece of legislation from 1982, the Low Level Radioactive Waste Policy Act. One of the things that that act did is it required that states would join together into regional compacts for the identification, location, and disposal of this low-level radioactive waste. So it led to the creation of compacts such as a Northeast Compact, a Southeast Compact, a Midwest Compact, a Western States Compact. And so the compacts were created based upon geography. Some of the compacts were very successful, some were not all that successful. One example of a very successful compact was the Southeast Compact. The Southeast Compact was very successful because of its membership. One of the members of the Southeast Compact was the state of South Carolina. And throughout the 70s and the 80s, there were two states in the country that tended to house and dispose of radioactive waste. Those two states were South Carolina and Nevada. So the compacts that had South Carolina and Nevada in them already had a leg up. And so for the Southeast Compact, South Carolina, according to the legislation, what you would have to have is one of the states would obviously have to step up and say, we'll be the first host of this low-level radioactive waste facility. South Carolina was very willing to step up because for years they had been receiving waste from other states and getting paid a fee for it. They had already had a disposal facility that they had built within South Carolina that had been in operation for many years. So they said, we'll go ahead, we'll take the waste first, and we'll be the first one on the board to do this. Well, they were able to do it. Contrast that to the Midwest Compact. None of the states in the Midwest Compact had a pre-existing disposal facility. So the Department of Education said, we will pay you, we will reimburse you for the construction of a waste facility. Well, states don't really trust the federal government when they say we will reimburse you. They really don't want to put their resources out front expecting federal reimbursement. So none of the states really wanted to do it. Ohio ended up drawing the short straw, and so they were the ones who would then have to build this facility. They built the facility, and they waited and waited for reimbursement from the Department of Energy, and that reimbursement never came through. So Ohio was kind of stuck. They had this disposal facility. They paid the entire cost of the disposal facility. Other members of the Midwest Compact basically said, well, you're kind of out of luck. You have to wait for the Department of Education to pay you. And so Ohio was not terribly efficient, and they were not very accepting of a lot of this radioactive waste because they really felt they got the short end of the stick. So that's an example of how some compacts can be very successful depending upon who the membership are. Some are a little bit less successful. And I think that's a good example of how Congress didn't really think through the creation of these radioactive waste disposal facilities and the creation of these regional compacts. That's a good example of Congress forcing states into these regional compacts. Oftentimes, states are not forced into these compacts. They choose to participate in these compacts. Because of the negative experience Ohio had, in future years, Ohio was relatively hesitant to join in new interstate compacts because they had such a negative experience with their last one. But that's one way in which states can cooperate with each other. Another way that Owen Bowman talks about is through multi-state legal action. This multi-state legal action typically flows through the Office of the State Attorney General. So states that are very high users of multi-state legal action tend to be those states that have very strong independent attorneys general. Here in California, we have a tradition of very strong independent attorneys general. From Brown through Kamala Harris, through now Bob Lockyer many years ago, Rob Bonta. We have some very active attorneys general. And so when you have an active attorney general who's very willing to go out there and sue tobacco companies and go out there and sue on behalf of consumer protection, your state's going to be a very high user of that type of an approach. And that's why California falls into the high category. Then a third approach that states can use to cooperate is the adoption of uniform state laws. where they will get together and decide, yes, we're all going to adopt the exact same law through our state legislature. And that same law will then have all the same stipulations across all the states who have adopted that uniform law. To kind of update the article a little bit, one good example of the adoption of uniform state laws is in the area of internet taxation. So for many years, states were trying to get access to commerce that occurred online and to be able to tax the value of that commerce. There is a famous Supreme Court case in 1992 called Quill versus North Dakota. And in the Quill versus North Dakota case, you had a situation where the state of North Dakota wanted to tax the transactions that were conducted between Quill Corporation and residents of North Dakota. The problem for North Dakota is that the Quill Corporation was a corporation that was located in the state of Minnesota. And now most of its interstate transactions at this time, because it was early 90s, was not being done online, but rather being done through catalog mail order. And so through their catalog mail order business, they were engaging in transactions with North Dakota residents. State of North Dakota said, we should be able to tax those because we're very reliant upon our sales tax. Quill Corporation says you cannot tax us because we don't have any physical entity within your state. We are completely housed within the state of Minnesota. So the case went all the way up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court in Quill versus North Dakota said that North Dakota may not tax transactions between Quill Corporation and residents of North Dakota because the Quill Corporation lacks what they called a physical presence nexus with the state. Now, if Quill Corporation had warehouses in North Dakota, then North Dakota could apply its taxation. If they had retail outlets, then North Dakota could apply its sales taxes. But because Quill Corporation had no physical presence in North Dakota was precluded from applying its sales tax rate. So in order to try and get access to taxing what are referred to as remote sellers, so Quill Corporation, because it was not located in North Dakota, it was considered to be a remote seller. And so states could not tax remote sellers. In order to get access to taxi transactions by remote sellers, states joined together in not really a compact, but in what they called a streamlined sales tax project. And all the states that participated in the streamlined sales tax project, they developed a uniform piece of state legislation that would allow them to collect taxation on remote sellers. It would impose a zero compliance burden on these remote sellers. And so what the state said is, we will contract with trusted third parties, and these trusted third parties will then calculate the tax that is owed, will then collect that taxation from corporations. So corporations will have a zero cost burden placed upon them for the collection of these taxes. And that's what that uniform piece of legislation said. So all the member states of this streamlined sales tax project would then adopt this uniform state law. And what the states had hoped is that they all adopted this uniform state law, they could then go to Congress and say, look, we all have the same state law, so therefore you should authorize the taxation of remote sellers. Now, the way in which these uniform state laws were adopted, they could either be adopted through the state legislature and then signed by the governor, or they could also be adopted through executive orders issued by the governor themselves. And so some states went through the state legislature, some states did it through executive orders through the governor's office. Now, this whole issue became moot because in 2018, I believe it was, we had the Wayfair case. And that's a case in which the Supreme Court then allowed states access to the sales tax, regardless of whether or not sellers are remote. So now today, states have access to taxing remote sellers who conduct transactions online. But this is kind of an example of how states would pass uniform state law in order to try and advocate for a change in policy within Congress. And so in terms of the use of this adoption of uniform state laws, here in California, we fall in the average category again. And you can see the majority of states, the vast majority of states fall into that average category. far more states in the average category, and I believe it's the average category, if I can read it without my glasses, is 6 to 9 uniform laws adopted. That's where most states reside. More than 9 uniform laws. You see, we've got about 10 or so states in that category. And then you got about 8 or states in the low category, meaning fewer than 6 uniform laws have been adopted. But the interesting thing about the Owen Bowman article is she really kind of puts a face on how states cooperate with each other. They do it through these compacts. They do it through multi-state legal action through their attorney general office. And they can also do it through adopting this uniform state legislation. Now, it is probably easier for states to do multi-state legal action because you're running it through one office in your state. Most state attorneys generals are members of the Attorney General Association, and so they meet frequently and they talk frequently. And that's really kind of the quickest way in which you can cooperate is through that multi-state legal action. Entering into an interstate compact is going to take a little bit longer because obviously you're going to have to design the compact. You're going to have to come up with the memorandum of understanding. Sometimes those are going to have to be approved by the state legislature and then signed by the governor. So it tends to be a much more protracted and lengthy process than engaging in this multi-state legal action. And we've had some really high-profile examples of how multi-state legal action has worked in suing tobacco companies and suing corporations whenever there are concerns about violation of consumer safety and consumer protection. And the more high-profile success states have with it, the more likely they are to continue using that as their chosen form of cooperation. But at least we can quantify this cooperation a little bit more because we now know the 3 specific distinct ways in which states can cooperate with each other. Now, again, the same barriers that we talked about with the Derthick article last week still persist in that they still get in these turf wars. They still do not always share the same goals and objectives. If you don't share the same goals and objectives, cooperation is probably not going to be at the top of your list of things to do. Let's move to the next article. I think because we only have 4 articles, we probably don't have to take a break tonight, and then we can be able to get out early this evening. But let's move to our next article. And the next article is The Ways of Achieving Federal Objectives, and that's another article by Martha Derthick. So we're kind of taking another double dip of Martha Derthick. So that one belongs to Alfonso. So let me make you a co-host. And I think you should be able to share right now.
All right. Hello, everyone. So I'll be leading our discussion for Chapter 12, Martha Derthick's Ways of Achieving Federal Objectives. Prior to asking some questions to facilitate our discussion, I'll go over some of the key points of the chapter. Okay, awesome. So the chapter was fairly short and straightforward. I discussed the relationship between federal administrators and state administrators from the federal perspective in relation to achieving federal goals, and how the federal government goes about influencing state politics. With that being said, the federal government holds no power in state politics, and it's important for federal administrators that this remain the impression. They don't want to be seen as meddling in state politics. In reality, the plan for influencing state politics is well thought out on how the federal government does that. And it primarily does this through the administration of grant funds and setting conditions on those grants. So before I go on, does anyone, and some of these questions are going to be the same as Chris's, so I apologize, but maybe we'll go through it quicker, I guess is a positive. Does anyone directly work with federal grant money or indirectly work with federal funds that are passed through state agencies? Emily, go for it.
Yeah, so I work for the Department of Fish and Wildlife, which is under the Natural Resources Agency. And I don't work directly with the grants. I'm not part of the management or anything like that. I'm more of the purchasing end of it. So I'm responsible for like making sure the funding codes are correct when there's different purchase requests from the various programs and projects. But I know that we do receive federal funding from the US, I believe the US Department of Fish and Wildlife, through the state wildlife grants that are it's just federal funds that are allocated to all the states' resource agencies. And I believe based on like size and population. And based on the recent budget freeze we had here in California, I have a feeling that those federal funds will, they'll be looking to that to really help us through this time, because there have been some pretty significant adjustments for in spending and also position placements too.
Wow. Yeah, I find that kind of interesting that there's a huge deficit, right? And then this article pretty much talks about how these agencies getting money, they kind of hold autonomy. And I think in this type of situation, I'm not sure if the state would want to have a lot of say if the federal government supplementing some of the costs that they would normally have to supplement or pay for. So yeah, on if nobody else has one on, I don't work directly with grant money either. Well, not sorry, I don't work directly with grant money, but within my department, I do have coworkers that receive funds through HUD and CDBG funds and home monies on that they don't work directly with HUD, but they work with the HCD, the Housing and Community Development for California. So with discussing these influences on state politics that the federal government has, the beginning of federal interest in state politics starts with grant funding being available in the first place. The goals of the federal government are outlined in the conditions of the available grants, and then the state discusses if they're interested in receiving the money. This is already a form of influence. At times, these items wouldn't be of particular interest to the state or in their radar because it was perhaps at one point deemed financially feasible, but as grants become available, then the conversation starts on again or for the first time. Stakeholders and legislators that may share the same view as the federal government see this opportunity to implement some policies that they may have in mind. And now this is a benefit to them because instead of discussing things that may not align with state goals, and they could just blame the federal government, the conditions of the grant to say that's why they're presenting these proposals. Third, the grants require specific conditions, as I mentioned, and the grant proposal need to be written in a specific way to align with those conditions. This creates a perception that the money, when taken, the state and the agencies will ultimately comply with those conditions and ultimately align with federal objectives. And lastly, not taking the funds may also cause some criticism. Essentially, the rhetoric becomes that how could you not take money if it's available and it helps constituents? So out of curiosity, has anyone ever written a federal grant proposal? And I think in our earlier presentation, we heard that we have, or a state proposal that dealt with federal monies? Yeah, Chris, go for it.
Yeah. So for my experience, I've had to write proposals, and kind of like what you're saying, there's almost this pressure of applying for this, especially when they come every year. Like there's a specific schedule for us at least, where it's like every fall, this specific grant called the Water Energy and Efficiency Grant comes out, and it's kind of like this unspoken thing where not like pressured in a bad way, but still pressured where we have to come up with some type of idea that we're gonna apply for that, unless we have a really specific reason why we don't. So it does make it challenging, especially with how strict some of these federal grant requirements are for sure.
Yeah, to a certain extent, I kind of have the same experience. We had a situation where we had applied for grants. I'm not sure if it was state or federal, and we had a lot of turnover, and we ended up not using those funds but we spent the money anyways. And then we were trying to kind of beg with the state to still let us kind of retroactively get those funds on, and the thought was the same, like how are you not going to do it, or else it'd come from your general fund. So yeah. So next on discussing federal allies, and this is a major component of how the federal government influences state politics. So the major and most convenient way for the government to achieve federal objectives is by having long-term allies in the form of state agencies. in particular agencies created for the sole purpose of administering federal funds. That's considered step one in the chapter. Step two is indoctrination, or to be less extreme, it's shaping values of the agency via professionalization. This means providing and requiring training and certifications, specifically for how to process on how to process and administer the grants and how it's supposed to be carried out specifically, and creating required guidelines for compliance with grant conditions, creating roles that specifically and solely deal with administering the grants and the activities in a specific way. Third, these organizations that deal exclusively with federal grants, absent of state funds, do not answer to state legislators and are known as single state agencies because they receive funding exclusively from the federal government. They gain autonomy from the state. They hold leverage over the state legislators because they're identified as the only experts on the topic. And lastly, this is a major benefit to the federal government because the agency serves as one point of contact, or the single point of contact, and no communication has to be had with legislators. That communication is indirectly had for the Fed by the state agencies. So on to the next question. Does anybody work for or has worked with an agency that has been created specifically for the purpose of administering grants? And if we haven't, can we name some examples of those types of agencies?
Hi, it's Claudia again. Sorry, I can't find my raise hand feature. I think I need to update my Zoom. But like I mentioned, while working at Parks and Rec for LA County, we worked a lot with the Regional Park and Open Space District. RPOSD is what we used to call them, and their specific, they were pretty much created to administer the LA County Regional Park and Open Space District grants and funding. So we worked a lot with them, and it's allotted funds that are collected. I think it's annually per unincorporated areas and as well as cities. So it was just working with them to submit the applications to just have the release of those funds for projects. And you could either let them collect through the years or take it out annually, as I mentioned. So we worked with them a lot. And their sole purpose was to administer and make sure that those grants are in compliance with audits and all that good stuff.
Okay, thank you. On no hands raised, so I'll move on to the next, and I'll provide some examples too. So one that I mentioned that I've worked with before too is on the HCD, the California Department of Housing and Community Development, which administers CDBG funds, block grant, and home funds. Another is the California Department of Public Health, administers federal public health programs and manages CDC funds. And the other is the California Department of Social Services, and they administer temporary assistance for needy families, and then the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. So lastly, the chapter mentions 3 additional forms of achieving state compliance. Ultimately, the federal government can withhold funds to achieve compliance. However, the chapter mentions that this is rarely done and almost impossible. However, the chapter also mentions that the threat alone is still a very useful tool for both federal and state administrators. State administrators, even with knowing that the likelihood is really slim that funds will be withheld, can still say that their actions to comply are done solely for the purpose of not losing funds. However, withholding funds and also detailed audits are not preferred channels because they may get in the way of maintaining healthy relationships with the state agencies and can embarrass states altogether. And so instead, the negotiations are preferred channels. Negotiations are quite often successful. This is because the federal government, as a last resort, is mainly interested in the perception of compliance. Conditions and guidelines are purposely broad in general in order for negotiations to end up successful. So our last question is, have you ever dealt with a threat of an agency withholding funds from you guys? And if not, is there some examples of when that's happened?
Um, I could go ahead and chime in on that, Alfonso. I'm having the same
Sure.
issue of being unable to locate the hand raised function. So currently right now I work with a nonprofit organization called 211 LA. And what the services that we provide is motel vouchers for families who are currently unhoused. And right now, our stakeholder, which is LASA, they are withholding funds, releasing the funds to my organization to make payments to the motels. So it's been causing a lot of dilemma, just going a lot of back and forth, and it's just a painful process, in other words, and constant calls of motel vendors upset, asking where their payment is. So that's very frustrating.
Okay. I think on so I have a slide later on talking about how update this article or this chapter for today's times. And on one of the ones that I put on there was audits and how I think audits are more commonplace. And maybe I think the chapter was written in the 70s. So maybe even withholding becomes more commonplace. Maybe agencies are less shy about embarrassing, or not, maybe embarrassing is the wrong word, but using that as a tool. Maybe that's one update to the article. But thank you, Irma. I've dealt with the situation a bit on a similar situation but more so with state policies rather than federal ones or federal monies. Recently, within the last decade, the state or HCD has imposed some pretty hefty housing policies on local agencies on essentially to things like rezoning to provide for more density, and on HCD constantly reminds or tells jurisdictions that withholding funds is a possibility if we don't implement those policies. And some of the other examples is the No Child Left Behind Act, which is no longer in effect, but it specifically dealt with the federal government threatening to withhold Title I funding. It also serves as an example of some of the other things I mentioned. So things working their way onto the state's agenda that would otherwise not have been discussed, like on implementing standardized testing and teachers being required to undergo certifications that are consistent with that type of learning and that type of teaching. The other, Dr. Powell had mentioned it before, is states were withheld money for not complying with the drinking age limit mandated by the federal government, and the 4 states on the screen were actually withheld those funds. And as I mentioned on kind of updating the chapter was written in the 1970s and made references dating back to the 1930s. So I wanted to make some comments on how it ties back to present day. The article mentioned that part of the practice of achieving federal objectives was that constituents were easily ignored, although I'm sure it still happens. And I think it's a bit more difficult now with the various channels that people have to voice their concerns. The process today may resemble something like you having to have the town halls or actually discuss the matter before passing the policies, rather than what the chapter stated that was common practice, was just writing a nice letter to people that may have had complaints about those policies. Second, the chapter also discussed how administrators are at an advantage because they are experts in the process and withhold information from legislators and withhold information of the specific processes that they undergo. As an example, I mentioned that previously withholding funds was really rare, and administrators know this, but administrators will still use that threat to kind of pass their practices. And in present day, I think there's so much knowledge, including this chapter, that a legislator could easily know, and a lot of individuals working for those legislators that could easily share that information with them. And then also third, I may have a lack of understanding what they were implying as audits, but it seems like they're commonplace. One of our management analysts is always preparing for HCD audits at least once a year. And then another one, I think Dr. Powell mentioned earlier today, that single state agencies are less commonplace. I think HCD is a good example. It was probably created to funnel on HUD monies down to local agencies, but now they're also a regulatory agency where they're trying to enforce on some of the housing policies that were implemented by state legislators. And with that, I conclude my discussion and presentation. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Alfonso. Very well done. Thank you, everyone who participated. I really like that last slide of updating the article. I think that's something we have to do with the vast majority of these articles. And you're right, this is an article from 1970, and so a lot of things have changed certainly since 1970. And I agree with you that this idea of the principal agent relationship, this whole idea that agencies can withhold information from principals, that's not quite as valid today as perhaps it was back in 1970. And you're right, it's not quite as valid because of all the free flow of information and the access to information that policymakers have today that perhaps they didn't have back in 1970. And so I do think that's a little bit less valid today than it was when Derthick was writing this article. I also, talking about this threat of withholding funds, it's I think what Derthick is saying, like as you described, is that it's almost like cutting off your nose to spite your face. That the national government wants this program, this policy to be successful. They want to achieve their policy goals. If you really do withhold the money, then you're not going to achieve those goals. And so it's kind of counterintuitive for them to actually withhold the money. So therefore, they may make a threat of withholding the money. Now, as Alfonso pointed out, there have been some instances where we have seen the national government withhold money from states in terms of the drinking age, in terms of blood alcohol content levels, in terms of national speed limit. And when the federal government wanted a national speed limit and states like Pennsylvania said, no, we're not going to abide by this 55-mile-per-hour speed limit, then the national government actually did remove highway funds from Pennsylvania. And Pennsylvania actually had millions upon millions of dollars withheld because of their refusal to adopt a 55-mile-per-hour speed limit. And so we have seen this withholding of funds actually happen. But the more you withhold the funds, the less likely it becomes that the national government will achieve its policy aims. If you continue to threaten the withholding of funds, the more you threaten it and then don't do it, the more you become like the boy who cried wolf. And so then state agencies and local agencies aren't going to believe you anymore that you're actually going to withhold those funds. And so I agree. That's one of those approaches that Derthick says is probably not the most effective approach to use. In terms of audits, I agree with Alfonso. There are a lot of audit requirements today. So depending upon the program and the enabling legislation for that program, you may have annual audits, you may have audits required every 6 months. So those audits do exist today, and they exist more today than they may have existed back in 1970. I think that's all part and parcel of this movement toward more sunshine, this movement toward more transparency in how we are spending public taxpayer dollars. I have seen some instances, though, where the national government, if they are unhappy with what a local agency is doing with federal money, where they can then kind of spring an audit upon them and say, well, we're not happy with how this money is being spent. So it's kind of a surprise, unscheduled audit. And sometimes in the enabling legislation for that grant, that may be actually in the enabling legislation, saying that the national government can pretty much at any time that it wants can require a special audit of the funds. And so sometimes you'll see those audits sprung on local governments. I agree with Esmeralda's comment in text chat about having a major beef with No Child Left Behind. I think most people who dealt with No Child Left Behind have a major beef with it. And one of the problems with No Child Left Behind goes back to the other Derthick article that we read last week in terms of this mismatch between prescription and practicality. And so when you have a piece of legislation like the No Child Left Behind Act, that prescribes that you will have 100% of your students across all your subgroups that will be proficient. The practicality of that is pretty much zero because statisticians will tell you it's impossible to ever get to 100%. And so I think that's a really good microcosm of that mismatch between prescription and practicality that we talked about last week. But if the national government wants to get a policy implemented in the way in which it wants it implemented, creating these allies, creating these agencies, and then kind of what John Gaventa would say, co-opting those agencies, capturing those agencies, that's one of the most efficient ways to do it. And that's one of the strategies we've seen the national government use for many, many years. But thank you, Alfonso. Thank you very much. And thank you for that discussion. The last article we have tonight deals with the issue of preemption. And it deals with the issue of preemption in kind of a political perspective. Then, when we get into our fiscal discussion next week and our administrative discussion the week after that, we are going to deal again and again with this idea of preemption. Because preemption is one of the primary strategies that we have seen the national government use in order to get state and local governments to come into compliance with national objectives. Now, whenever we use the term preemption, whenever we say the national government is preempting a state or local government, what we are essentially saying is the national government is taking away the decision-making power of that state or local government in this policy area. So the national government's coming in saying, state and local governments, you no longer have the legal authority to make a decision in this area. You must abide by the decision that was made by the national government. That's what we refer to as preemption in intergovernmental relations. Now, there are different gradations of preemption. There can be full preemption, and that's when the national government comes in and fully tells the state or local government, you no longer have the legal right to make a decision in this policy area. One good example of full preemption, to go back to the issue of internet taxation, was a few years ago, Congress decided to completely preempt state government ability to pass these things called internet access taxes. And so with an internet access tax, what the state would do is the state would allow the implementation of taxation on the fee that people pay each month to their internet service provider to get access to the internet. So if you pay $20 a month to your ISP in order to get access to the internet, the state could then apply a taxation to that. That was an internet access tax. Congress decided that there would be no more internet access taxes. At the time that Congress decided to do that, there were 10 states that were still using internet access taxes. So Congress came in and said, as of January of, I believe it was 2007, any state that is currently using an internet access tax may no longer collect revenue from that tax. And any state that wants to impose a new internet access tax is preempted from doing so. So that's an example of complete and full preemption of state and local authority. So that's full preemption. What we are much more common, was much more common today, and we're much more familiar with, is partial preemption. And this is what we see used all the time in environmental protection. So the federal government will say, here is the national minimum standard for air quality or for water quality. This is the national minimum standard. State governments, you can then adopt the standard that is stricter, that is above the federal minimum standard, but you cannot adopt a law that is less strict than the federal minimum standard. You have to at least abide by that federal minimum standard. So here in California, we routinely go above the federal minimum standard for fuel emissions, air quality, water quality. We usually go above and beyond. And we are allowed to do that under partial preemption. It's only partial preemption because you're only preempted from passing a law that is less strict, but you're still free to pass a law that is more strict than the federal minimum standard. In partial preemption with environmental regulation, that's usually what we see, is we see these minimum standards that are established by the national government. The other approach to preemption is to establish maximum standards, where the federal government will come in and say, here is the strictest standard that any state can have. You cannot then go above that. You can go below it if you want, but you cannot go above this federal maximum standard. Now, that's a relatively unusual approach. But in the Trump administration, we saw that approach used in the Trump administration, where the Trump administration came to California and said, your environmental regulations are too strict. And so therefore, we want this to be the maximum nationwide, and we do not want to allow you to go above that maximum standard. And if you go above that maximum standard, we are going to start withholding funds from the state of California. So that was kind of an unusual approach, but that was an approach that we saw taken in the Trump administration. Typically, it's more that minimum approach to partial preemption. So it can be full preemption or it can be partial preemption, but either way, some state and local authority is being preempted, it's being taken away by the national government. So this article is an article, really a report that was written for the National Academy of Public Administration, otherwise known as NAPA. And in this report, the authors are looking at identifying some trends in the patterns of preemption over the past several years. I think this is from 2006, but from the pattern from some previous years, and then coming up with some recommendations for how we can approach and how we can counter preemption. So one of the first findings in this report is that there has been a rise in federal preemption in recent years. Not only have there been more federal preemptions of state and local decision-making authority, but the scope of those preemptions has also expanded in that traditionally preemptions were being done primarily for business regulation, for consumer protection, but we have seen that scope expand in recent years. So it's not only the number of preemptions, but also the scope of what these preemptions are about that have increased. Now, that's the pattern up to 2006. The question then is, has that pattern continued? And again, I do think we can see examples of how that pattern certainly has continued. I gave you that one example of the internet access tax prohibition. That's an example of how Congress has continued with these preemptive efforts. Preemption occurs typically when the national government does not trust state governments to come into alignment with national expectations. So if you cannot induce them with grants to come into alignment with national expectations, then you will force them to abide by national expectations by taking away their decision-making authority. The more federal preemption you have, and the larger the scope of federal preemption, that will lead to more centralization of power in Washington, D.C. And that's the second finding of the report. Not surprisingly, the more preemption you have, the more centralization of power you have. The more centralization of power you have at the national level, the more likely it is to come to finding number 3, which is it leads to an undermining of the service capacity of state and local governments. Now, we typically think of state governments as being the laboratories for democracy. We've got all these 50 different state governments. These 50 different state governments can come up with 50 different approaches to dealing with policy problems. They are our laboratories of democracy. We try these things out at the state level. If they work well at the state level, then perhaps they can then migrate their way up to the national level. So things like the Affordable Care Act, the antecedents of the Affordable Care Act came from state initiatives in states such as Massachusetts and Oregon. Welfare reform in the 1990s. The antecedents of that came from a lot of the welfare reform that was done under Tommy Thompson in the state of Wisconsin. And so you need to allow these states to experiment in order to have these new innovative approaches that the federal government can then leverage. The problem is when you have a lot of federal preemption, you limit the ability of these state governments to be these laboratories of democracy. So they don't have the flexibility to be as creative as they were in the past. Now, we did see in the 1990s the use of a lot of waivers. And there is an article that we'll read later on called Federalism by Waiver. And in that article, not to bury the lead so too much for the person who's going to lead that discussion, but we saw a lot of states being given the ability through federal waivers to be these laboratories of democracy. But the more preemption you have, the fewer waivers you have, the less flexibility you have for states to do those types of things. The fourth finding is the more preemption you have from the national government, the more fiscal squeeze occurs for state and local governments. The more you have these orders coming out of Washington, D.C., oftentimes these mandates are not coming attached with money. So you've got a lot of these unfunded and a lot of these partially funded mandates that flow down to state and local governments. The old adage in federalism is in federalism, everything flows downhill except for money. So orders and requirements flow downhill, but the money doesn't flow downhill in conjunction with them. So the more unfunded and partially funded mandates you have, the more this fiscal squeeze you have felt by state and local governments. The fifth finding is that it doesn't have to be this way. The fifth finding is there are some options where we can have joint action taken by national and state governments, where national and state governments can work together. And the report then provides us with some alternative ways in which we can approach these issues without having complete federal preemption. One alternative we've already discussed, and that's partial preemption. So instead of completely preempting the decision-making authority of state and local governments, we'll do partial preemption. And hopefully partial preemption with those minimum standards and then free up states to then go above and beyond those federal minimum standards. They also call for these federal partnerships, these partnerships between state and federal governments in decision-making and coming up with these solutions to our policy problems. The use of uniform state laws, which we talked about with that article by Owen Bowman as one of the approaches towards state cooperation. More use of interstate compacts, which we also talked about with the Owen Bowman article. And then federal incentives to encourage state governments to engage in certain types of consistent action. So providing real money, real resources from the national level down to the state level to try and alleviate some of this fiscal squeeze that's been caused by this rise in the number and the scope of preemptions. The sixth finding is to enhance our capacity to do assessments of federalism issues. Now, the problem that we are facing in 2006 and we are still facing today is the loss of the U.S. Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations. So the primary vehicle for a lot of these federalism assessments was the ACIR, Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations. That advisory commission was zeroed out of the fiscal year 1996 budget, and the ACIR then went out of existence. It had been around since the 1950s, producing all of these assessments of federalism and how the different levels of government are interacting with each other, the most efficient way in which the different levels can interact with each other across a broad variety of different policy areas. In the absence of the ACIR, that creates a tremendous void where we do not have any organizations that stepped up to fill that void as of the writing of this article in 2006. And I would argue that we still have not had organizations to step up and fill that void even as of today in 2024. So based upon these findings, the report then issues some recommendations of how we can address some of these problems. One recommendation they have is to create a new federalism strategy. And they recommend the passage of this thing called an Intergovernmental Partnership Act, otherwise known as an IPA. And also what they refer to as an FAP, a Federalism Action Plan, where we can put together this action plan whereby we can think of these partnerships that we can work out between federal and state governments and actually make some tangible changes to try and deal with this increasing wave of preemption. Secondly, they talk about creating a national dialogue whereby we start talking about intergovernmental issues. Now, the problem with that recommendation, intergovernmental politics tends to be, as many authors refer to it, as a bloodless example of politics. So we don't really see a lot of the shedding of the blood with these intergovernmental types of negotiations and discussions. What is much sexier, as was said, what is much more appealing to people are those policy decisions. Intergovernmental decisions tend to be much more about the day-to-day implementation and who's going to pay what bills. that is not quite as appealing to voters and to citizens as your more high-profile traditional policy discussions. So creating this national dialogue is proving to be very difficult because, for lack of a better way of saying it, your average ordinary citizen doesn't really care much about federalism and intergovernmental relations. They don't care about the minutia. They don't care about the details of how these policies are being implemented. They are rational, self-interested actors, so they are much more concerned about what does this policy mean for me on a daily basis? What does it mean for my family? What does it mean for my bottom line? And so I think it's very difficult for us to get people engaged in having a dialogue about intergovernmental relations. The third recommendation is making these federalism assessments. Now, back in the mid-1990s, we had the passage of this thing called the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act. And we'll talk a lot more about that in a couple of weeks when we get into the administrative aspects of federalism. But the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act, the primary champion of that was the National League of Cities. And the primary purpose of the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act was to make sure that if Congress is going to promulgate a mandate upon state governments, that Congress will pay for the costs of that mandate. This is very much in alignment with that principle that we talked about in our first week together of subsidiarity. That the national government tells a subnational government to take a certain type of action, it's incumbent upon the national government to provide resources for them to do that. So this Unfunded Mandates Reform Act was meant to try and provide for this subsidiarity. It was a rhetorical success in that the National League of Cities claimed credit for it. It really got Congress thinking about, well, how are we going to fund these mandates that we are placing upon state and local governments? The problem is it was a rhetorical success, but it was much less of a practical success. And that's because of the way in which the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act was written. The Unfunded Mandates Reform Act was written not to be a proactive piece of legislation, to be much more reactive in nature. And so what it required is if the fiscal impact on a state would be, or on the states collectively, would be more than this threshold amount, then what Congress has to do is it would have to provide funding. Well, to know what the actual fiscal impact would be, and if it exceeded that threshold amount, you would then have to have an assessment done. And so the Congressional Budget Office, when it was in charge with the primary responsibility of determining what is the fiscal impact of this proposed mandate in conjunction with the Government Accountability Office. The problem, though, is in order to have that assessment done, a member of Congress, while this mandate was being considered, would have to rise to a point of order. And so in the House, they'd have to say, Madam Speaker, or Mr. Speaker, I rise to a point of order. This proposed legislation violates the provisions of the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act. If that point of order is sustained, then Congress will direct the CBO and or the GAO to go out there and perform this assessment to see how much of a fiscal impact this will have on states. However, if no member rises to that point of order, then the assessment is never done. That's why I refer to it as a reactive piece of legislation. Another problem with the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act is that it only applied to mandates moving forward from 1996. All those mandates that were already on the books would then not be covered under the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act. So it essentially is a loophole large enough that you can drive a semi-truck through. So very few mandates were actually impacted by this Unfunded Mandates Reform Act because many of the assessments just simply were not triggered by a point of order. When we look at the effectiveness of the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act, we see that the biggest impact that it had is in terms of gradually slowing down the implementation of mandates as opposed to stopping their implementation. So if someone does rise to a point of order and the assessment is done, and we find out, say, for instance, that in that given year, the threshold was a $50 million impact. If it goes above $50 million, then Congress would have to at least partially fund it. Well, in order to get around that, all you really need to do is say, well, we will just implement it gradually. So we'll put together an implementation schedule where we'll implement it over a 10-year period of time. And if you implement over a 10-year period of time, then the impact is only $5 million per year. That is short of the $50 million threshold. Therefore, Congress does not have to fund that mandate. So that was another huge loophole that Congress found. So it did slow down the implementation of mandates, but it never really stopped the implementation of any mandate that Congress wanted to implement upon state governments. Now, despite the fact that state governments complained about these partially funded and unfunded mandates, it did not preclude state governments from imposing partially funded and unfunded mandates on their local governments. And so local governments started to cry foul and said, well, you've got this Unfunded Mandates Reform Act that at least should slow down the implementation of mandates from the national to the state level, but what's protecting us as local governments? And so several states then passed their own little unfunded mandates reform acts. We have one of those here in California. It was what's called Proposition 1A. And one of the unfortunate things here in California is we tend to reuse proposition numbers. And so there are multiple Proposition 1As, there are multiple Proposition 13s, there are multiple Proposition 57s. So we tend to reuse the numbers. But in this Proposition 1A, it would limit the ability of the state to impose unfunded mandates on local governments unless there was a situation of fiscal exigency, otherwise known as a fiscal emergency. So if either the governor or the state legislature says we have a fiscal emergency, if that does not happen, then the state government is precluded from passing along unfunded mandates to local governments. However, if either the state legislature or the governor stands up and says, we have a fiscal emergency, our revenues are trailing behind our forecasts, then that would be enough to then make Proposition 1A inoperative for that fiscal year, and the state could go ahead and push those unfunded mandates down to local governments. That's why we continue to see those unfunded mandates at the local level, irrespective of the passage of this little Unfunded Mandates Reform Act in Proposition 1A. So even though we have put in place some mechanisms for making assessments of these impacts on state and local governments, oftentimes those assessments just simply do not occur. A fourth recommendation is the passage of this thing called the Intergovernmental Partnership Act. And they go through some specifics here, saying that in this Intergovernmental Partnership Act, it should do several things. And we won't go through all the specifics, but the article lists out for you different titles of the act. And so like in Title 1 of the act, the Title 1 of the act should have a sunset provision, whereby any of these types of preemptive measures will have a sunset provision. So they'll only last for 5 years, or they'll only last for 7 years. And then if Congress or state legislature would want to go back and reauthorize them, they would have to do that and have that discussion again. So you'll have no preemptive mandates that would be permanent. They would all have some type of sunset provision in them. Mechanisms for a participation on the part of state and local governments. So if this preemption is going to preempt the decision-making of state or local government, then they should be allowed into the decision-making process. So they advocate for this Intergovernmental Partnership Act. They also advocate for the implementation, further implementation of this thing called an executive order. They don't give you the number for it, but the executive order that they're referring to is Executive Order 13132. So the one they're really referring to is Executive Order 13132. Put that in text chat. And that's a very important executive order that was first issued in the Clinton administration in the 1990s. EO 13132 required that if federal agencies were adopting a rule, and that rule would have fiscal implications for state and local governments, before the adoption of that rule, an assessment would have to be done to determine exactly how much this new rule would cost state and local governments. So it takes it beyond the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act that quote unquote required these assessments for congressional action. Now it's expanding this requirement for assessments to the agency level, saying that federal agencies are going to promulgate these rules. They must also conduct these federalism assessments. They also recommend this federalism action plan to, again, revisit some of the things that state governments are doing and to allow state governments the opportunity to come up with their model approaches. And then the federal government can learn from what states are doing to, again, kind of free them up to be these laboratories of democracy. And then finally, the last recommendation is to create a federalism research agenda. The problem with creating a federalism research agenda is it's much more difficult in the absence of an organizing institution. We used to have that organizing institution in the U.S. Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations. In the absence of the ACAR, we don't really have that centralizing force to drive this federalism research agenda. So instead, what we have is we have federalism scholars across the country who are doing very good research into federalism, but there is not really a forum to bring all that research together. Granted, there is a journal, there's Publius, the Journal of Federalism, but most policymakers don't read Publius, the Journal of Federalism. Publius is read by federalism scholars, so it's kind of like this echo chamber. So we really don't have any organizing body in order to create and to manage this federalism research agenda. What the authors of the study want to do is they want NAPA, the National Academy for Public Administration, to step into this void. And that's their primary recommendation in 2006. We are now 18 years removed from the writing of this report, and NAPA has still not fully stepped into that void. No organization has stepped into that void. So the concern is that the ACAR was abolished in 1996. We are now 28 years removed from the ACAR. The farther we are removed from the elimination of the ACAR, the less likely it is that people are going to think that it was necessary. We've existed 28 years without it. So why would we have to put our resources into it now? In the last session of Congress, in the 23-24 session of Congress, Congress introduced a bill to create a new Commission on Intergovernmental Relations. And you and I both know how far that got. But at least it was introduced. So at least there are people in Congress who are thinking about funding a new commission, but it's very highly unlikely that we're ever going to see funds go toward it, especially when we are struggling with a budget deficit like we continue to struggle with at the national level. So essentially, the moral of the story is that it is incumbent upon us as those who study federalism and intergovernmental relations to kind of keep these issues alive because we don't have an organizing institution to do it for us. We don't have a central clearinghouse for these types of studies. And everyday average citizens typically don't care about these federalism questions because it's the bloodless type of debates that we have in intergovernmental relations. So it's really up to us in classes like this to kind of keep federalism and intergovernmental relations alive. Now, preemption is something that has continued. So to update this from 2006, we still see federal preemption. The nature of that preemption really does depend upon the issue. Like we talked about in our first class session together, I really do feel that we are in an era of contextual federalism, where the balance of power really depends upon the issue itself. In some issues, we see more federal preemption than we see in other issues. I mentioned to you last week the nuanced federalism approach of the Obama administration when it came to marijuana law. And so we don't see the federal government coming in and preempting state authority to make marijuana law. Instead, we see the federal government taking a very hands-off approach in that type of a regard. Special education policy, we still see a lot of federal preemption. We see the federal government coming in saying, in order to get this federal special education money, you have to do these very specific types of things and abide by these very specific federal regulations. If any of you are managing grants in the course of your normal work, you probably see some of this federal preemption as well. where you have to take certain actions that are dictated to you by the national government in order to continue funding this program and continue keeping that grant money alive. So preemption is alive and well, but it really depends upon the issue that we are dealing with. Preemption is oftentimes a very political issue, which is the reason why the preemption article is in this week's readings. Preemption can achieve some political goals for political parties. And so sometimes you'll have administrations come in, they will have their policy aims they want to achieve. Preemption is one of the most effective and efficient ways that they can achieve those policy goals. So there is very much a political aspect to the use of this preemption. We will revisit preemption again, not just next week when we talk about fiscal federalism, but the following week when we talk about administrative federalism as well. Let me at this point share out our spreadsheet for you so that we can make sure we're all on the same page with where we are going now. So next week, we're going to kind of turn the page to a discussion of fiscal federalism. But do be warned, a lot of these articles, if you have not looked at them yet, look at fiscal federalism from a political type of perspective. So it kind of blends this week and next week together. So for instance, articles like the Moneypenny article on federal grants and aid, the Why Categorical Grants article by the US ACIR, the 10th Commandments article, all those articles have a very political element to them as they talk about the fiscal implications of federalism. So with these fiscal federalism articles, the one we'll start with, The Economics of Intergovernmental Grants by George Brake. No one signed up for that one, which is absolutely fine. I will do that one. It's a very descriptive article that describes to us different types of grants and how grants are allocated by the federal government. So it's kind of a starting point for understanding how grants work in our system of federalism. So we'll start off with that one next week. Then we will go, my eyes are skipping around here. Then we will go to the Moneypenny article, Federal Grants and Aid, and that one I believe is Jeremy's. Then we'll go to the Entrepreneurial Cities article by Alberta Spraja, and that one I believe belongs to Heidi. Then we'll go to the Why Categorical Grants article by the ACIR, and I believe that one belongs to Claudia. Financing Local Government in a Changing World, the Bernori article, and that one belongs to Amanda. And then we'll wrap up the show next week with 10th Commandments, the Nivola article, and that one belongs to Alexa. So next week we have 6 articles that we are going to be doing. So next week's session will be a little bit longer than tonight, but it'll get us into understanding intergovernmental relations from more of a financial fiscal type of perspective. Also, then for next week, you have another discussion board post that you'll be doing. For the second discussion board post, you'll be selecting a specific issue, a specific policy, talking about the balance of power between the different levels of government on that issue or that policy. And please pay particular attention to how that balance of power may have changed. So when you select an issue, try and select an issue where the balance of power has changed. So either the federal government has assumed more power over the issue or state governments have assumed more power, but an issue where you can really characterize some of that shifting in the balance of power between the different levels of government. And that will then be for discussion post number 2, which will then be due for next week. Any questions or observations on any of these political articles we talked about for this week or anything that we're going to be doing next week in our discussion of fiscal federalism? Okay. I think we have just about everyone signed up for articles, as you'll see as we go through our schedule. Fortunately for you all, fewer and fewer articles that are left to me, and then we'll have more and more discussions. And so I think that's really the nature of a graduate seminar like this. I was very happy with the discussions last week, very happy with the discussions this week. And so if you're leading a discussion next week, follow what was done the last 2 weeks, and I'm sure you'll have a good discussion. I really appreciate everyone participating in those discussions. The quality of discussion is really based upon your willingness to participate in that discussion. Okay. All right, well, we'll have an early night tonight. We'll call it a night. I'll have this recording up on our site by tomorrow morning, and then we'll be back at it with fiscal federalism then next Monday on the 28th at 6 o'clock. So hope everyone has a great week, and I'll talk to you again then next Monday.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Thank you.
Thanks. Have a great week.